On this episode of Fast Forward, my guest is British author Joshua Provan. Josh, as he is known to his friends, runs a very popular history blog called Adventures in Historyland. He is also a very active and responsible commentator on historical topics on social media and elsewhere. Blessed with the gift of prose, he has utilized it rather well in writing his first book, Wild East, the British in Japan, 1854 to 68. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this episode of Fast Forward, the show where I speak to historians, authors, social scientists, political scientists, university professors, and ask their views on historical topics. Today, as you know, we have with us Joshua Provan, who is an English author, a historian, a military history enthusiast, in many ways a partner in crime. Many people don't know that, Josh and I are connected in several ways, one of which is through a Facebook page, which is called Britannia Magazine, which some of us had started a few years back, though most of us have been writing books ever since, so activity on that front has been pretty dormant. But we hope to revive that at some point. But of course, the connection stays between all of us and all the people. And hopefully I'm going to get all of them on my show. And we will have some fun conversations, starting with this one. Josh and I are also connected in another way. We both are big fanboys of the Duke of Wellington, with the debate only being around who is the bigger fan. And in this, I'm going to concede ground because I don't want to embarrass the English people that, again, an Indian can be a bigger fan than the Duke of Wellington. So I'll concede that any day to Josh. Josh also does a few other things, which I think are quite fascinating because I keep seeing his Facebook posts or updates. And he practices sword fighting. He also does some amount of horse archery, which I see. I haven't seen the live video yet, but of course I do see posts. He's also done some.
I do think I need to and just in the name of I don't know, people suddenly asking you about my horse archery. I have not ever actually done horse archery. I've done archery, and I would love to do horse archery, but it's just an interest of a distant interest at the moment. I have played polo before. Had polo lessons before. So
all right. Well, once you have started playing polo, and which is, it reminds me of the colonial period when both Englishmen and Indians used to play. All the Maharajas would, they took pride in the fact that they were expert polo players, and there would be times when they would defeat English team. They took a great amount of pride in that. So
excellent.
And I also have seen photos of you where you have done some windsurfing.
Yes, surfing, just surfing.
Okay. Mm-hmm. So pretty much a field person, and now you are writing a book sitting on the desk. So you have written one book already called The Wild East. You are working on your next book, which is in production right now. So do you think there was a transition in that? I mean, somebody who was so much into field work has been now writing books, sitting on the desk, spending lonely hours.
I don't know. Yes, I've always enjoyed being outdoors ever since I was a little kid. Riding horses and playing games in the forest and things like that when I was on holiday, and lots of active things, I think. But I think a lot of my friends don't see that side of me very much. A lot of my family think I'm quite averse to activity, which is interesting. And I think I have always wanted to write a book. And so I think I achieved a fairly decent balance, even in terms of being able to write the book. It obviously requires a lot of indoor time, and a lot of research time, and also still being able to enjoy the things I like outdoors, and even indoor sports like sword fencing and things like that. That being said, that comes at a cost, because there are these things called deadlines. And if you spend too much time doing the things you enjoy rather than the things that you must do, then sometimes things can get a little nerve-wracking. And there was a few times writing Wild East, certainly, that I was pushing the wire a little bit.
Well, I understand that completely, because I have written a book as well, and I'm working on my second book, as you know, and I don't do much outdoor activity myself. But let's come to your book, and I found it very fascinating the way you have put the whole thing in context in your introduction. You talk about the timelines, you talk about the first Englishman, William Adams, and how he wins 2 swords.
Yeah.
And then, of course, you have other characters that come in, characters which are familiar to me, because in the university I had a paper in my master's on the history of Japan. So people like Tokugawa Ieyasu are very familiar figures that way, the first shogun, and also, interestingly, a contemporary of Emperor Akbar.
Ah.
So you curiously name your book Wild East. Why is that?
Why is that? Well, I would love to say it was the product of a great amount of thought and some sort of clever twist in my mind about it. But actually, I had originally, when I wrote out the proposal to send to the publisher, I originally called it, under a sort of a working title, something very flowery, like Lifting the Curtain or something like that, which is a phrase that is vaguely related to the period of Japanese history that this book is set in, which is called the Bakumatsu. And it's not a direct translation or anything like that. I've just heard it said in relation to that phrase. And I originally called it that, but then further down the proposal, I wrote out something like, this is a tale of the Wild East, as opposed to all the tales of the Wild West that you get.
Right.
And the publisher said, because they liked the proposal straight off the bat, which was shocking to me. But he said that I think we should call it Wild East because it's just catchier. And I said, and to be honest with you, it had been a consideration to call it the Wild East. I shied away from it because to call just the period of Japanese history the Wild East, I thought was too. It's a focused subject, and the Wild East technically would be a much larger subject, to be honest, in how you might interpret that name. But yeah, that was pretty much it. I had this phrase in my head. I put it on the paper. I had it initially sort of not rejected it as a title, but certainly had it as a theme in my mind and my publisher said, go with that because it's just catchier. And I said, okay, I had no objection to it because it is very much a Wild West flavor to a lot of what happens, but of course on the other side of the world, to like Dodge City and things like that.
Right. Why Japan? I thought that your first book would be something very different, but I was actually quite surprised when you told me that you're writing a book on Japan, British in Japan. So that's something which does not come very obviously. So I would like you to speak on that. Why Japan? Why did you think that was necessary?
This book could be set. If I was to do a documentary about the making of this book, I think I would probably call it the accidental history of Japan or something like that, because of the late Edo period or something. Because about 2015 or something like that, I was sort of very much into researching the Waterloo campaign and the Duke of Wellington and things like that. And at that time, the Victorian Wars Forum, which used to be run by our mutual friend Mark Simner, was the Victorian Wars Forum was up and running, still live, and I used to be on that forum, and I used to talk to people and ask questions and things like that. And I had seen, I think, something to do with the movie The Last Samurai. I hadn't seen the movie at that point, but I had seen some people talking about it. And I looked at what the story was, and it's about an American who goes to Japan to train the Imperial Army. And I knew about the Perry mission to Japan, the event that opened it commercially to the rest of the world. And I suddenly wondered to myself, and I say this in the introduction. So, what were the British doing in Japan at this time? Obviously, I knew about the Opium Wars, and the British were involved in that. And from that question, I also then asked the question when I realized that Japan became the only Asian Eastern power to join the League of Nations. A column of questions just started to bombard me, basically, one after another. Just asking the question, okay, why did Japan not get colonized the way China did? What were the British doing there? What was going on over there at this time? Because was it just the Americans? Was it everybody else? Things like that. And so I went in the Victorian Wars Forum and I just asked this question: what were the British? Did the British do anything in Japan at this time? And somebody sent me a Wikipedia link to something called the Bombardment of Shimonoseki.
Right.
And I thought, oh, that's interesting. So there was some gunboat diplomacy going on over there. And I didn't really think much more about it. But as the years went on, over the next 2 or 3 years, I just started randomly, because I was always doing something else, randomly just finding things about the British in Japan. And also, as if fate had something to do with it, these things I kept finding were connected to each other in some way. For instance, I happened to come across the book written by the diplomat and translator Ernest Satow, who is a big player in the book, and I read that and I thought, well, this will make some really good blog posts for Adventures in Historyland. And so I started more seriously looking at life in Yokohama during the 1860s with the intention of doing a series of blog posts about people living in Yokohama. And then around 2017, I had more or less realized this was a book, really. There was masses of information that, due to various reasons such as out-of-print books only being available in libraries, books being now out of print and too expensive, there is not a lot you can easily read that puts all of these things together in one place. For a price that people might be willing to pay, or if should anybody be interested, like I was, because when I was looking around, there was nothing particularly that I could read that focused specifically on the British in Japan. And so from 2017 onwards, I started working on it more as just collecting more and more and more information. And then a series of events occurred that led to the book being basically accepted by the publisher, and that is why Japan. That's why it was Japan. It wasn't planned particularly at first to be Japan as my first book. I had always envisioned doing a novel first before tackling actual history. But that was why Japan. I think in many ways, just like Japan of the 1860s beguiled so many British people who visited it, I too just became more and more beguiled by their stories and the way they were connected to each other through this period of time.
Right. You also give the example of Lord Elgin, his campaign there, and he was willing to break away from Shanghai because that was thought to be pretty depressing at that point. Of course, that would be quite a contrast with Shanghai today. But of course, they were looking forward to that relief, going towards Nagasaki and the Japanese coast, essentially. So You talk about that. So if you could just take us through that.
Yeah. Okay. So he's an interesting man, Lord Elgin.
Mm-hmm.
He is a famous imperialist in terms of popular imagination. If you know anything about the Opium Wars, yeah.
Elgin Marble.
Yeah. He's very famous. That is him. Yeah, or his brother, because there was two of them. But Bruce out of Elgin was very famous man in terms of colonial history. Infamous man, some might say.
Right.
But he was also reluctant in a way as well. He saw the things that he ended up doing, especially such things as the burning of the Summer Palace in China during the Second Opium War, as a great shame, as something that he regretted deeply. Not that I think he may have regretted on moral terms, perhaps, but on the terms that it was just so sad that he felt it had to happen. Maybe. I wouldn't want to speak too deeply on that because it's not the subject that I studied his accounts for. And so, but I got that feeling that he was very reluctant to see what happened in China replayed in Japan.
Mm-hmm.
And with that in mind, with that sort of burden in mind, and the fact that most British people found the cities of the China coast very, very depressing places, as you say, the chance to get away to a place that was a complete mystery was greatly attractive to him after months of negotiating with the Qing Empire as the summer season came onto the southern China, which the captain of the ship that took him to Japan said whoever was sad to leave a port in China. And so he had this mission to do a treaty with the Qing Empire, and at the same time he had this secret mission to go over to Japan, a secret order from the Foreign Office essentially telling him to go and make a treaty with the Japanese, because by this time Japan had been, in quotes, opened to foreign trade because of the American intervention, and there had been a limited treaty made by the Royal Navy essentially that followed up that event. And he was basically sent over to just formalize a treaty of commerce, an Amity commerce, I think they called it, which was just to set out what cities they could trade in. It was on the Chinese model, what cities you could trade in, and the rules around the trading that could happen. And that was his mission. That was why he went to Japan. And he went out there with a man called Lawrence Oliphant. He was a prolific travel writer and something of a Christian mystic, and a very interesting man himself. And both of their accounts just they do touch on the treaties and things like that, and how difficult it was in some ways and how easy it was in others. But it was like a holiday. Their accounts of it is like just wondering at everything around them and being just so interested in the way life was being lived in Nagasaki and Edo. And it was just they left with the fondest memories. Oliphant goes into raptures about Japan. And he says he would very much hate to be employed in China, but he would jump to be employed in the diplomatic service in Japan, just because they found it so pleasant, really. You could do an entire book, I'm serious, you could do an entire book about the British on holiday in Japan during this time.
I also found your description quite fascinating, because you talk about the British legation figuring out that, okay, they see that there are very European Western style ships on the harbor, and they think that maybe some other European power has beaten them. And then they realize that it's actually, these are Japanese ships. So Japan has started to modernize pretty rapidly. And they're also insulted by the locals as being people from China, right? So I found that quite interesting. So if you could just tell us about that a bit more.
Okay. For a very long time, and I'm sorry I can't be too as specific as I should be here because I have forgotten the date exactly. But the prohibition, if that's the right word, on foreign literature and the translating of it had been lifted during the later middle Edo period, which is, by the way, the reign of the Tokugawa shoguns, who ruled from Edo, which is now Tokyo. And when that was lifted, a great kind of intellectual renaissance erupted across the literate society of Japan, where the thirst for Western learning became very pronounced. And so schools were founded that were dedicated to the study of Western sciences. This was before Japan was opened or anything like that. And a great drive to modernize was to be seen. Now, that's why it's such an interesting period to look at if you have the time to study it, because there's this period of great movement and mobilization in society, where the Japanese lords, the daimyos, lots of them begin to try and modernize their fiefs and domains, especially in the south, like the daimyo of Satsuma set up factories and encouraged photography and things like that in what is now Kagoshima prefecture. And this was all made possible essentially because although they had cast out all foreigners during the beginning of the Edo period, they had allowed the Dutch to maintain a small presence on the island of Decima at Nagasaki. And through this portal, they were able to draw on Western sciences and philosophy and other things like that. And so Dutch translations of other works were translated into Japanese during the period before the intervention of the Americans. And the Dutch, and this included shipbuilding, weaponry, gun manufacture, medical sciences, and things like that. And so the modern ships that the British saw when they came in were ships that had been built essentially along the lines of Dutch men of war during the time when they wanted to try and modernize their country, because they felt that it's only a matter of time, especially having seen what was happening in China, that they needed to start thinking about Japan in the global scene, And so for some reason, the British didn't think that Japan had any modern-looking ships. For some reason, although they were quite aware that the Dutch had been in contact with the Japanese for a good 2 centuries, they didn't think that had really done much. But of course it had. And this was this nervous moment where they wondered if the Prussians or the Russians or someone had got to Edo first, is a direct result of the fact that the Japanese had been, at least on a domain level, trying to modernize. And so these are the ships that they saw. These were essentially Dutch-built men of war, flying the Japanese flag, and that's that. They were, because at this stage everybody was afraid. Well, the British were certainly afraid that people were going to beat them to the punch and get better deals and become more chummy with the Japanese than they were. So it was a great source of concern that someone might have got their warships to Edo before they had. Because remember as well, technically you weren't allowed to approach Edo with warships. It was not allowed at all. You were supposed to dock at Nagasaki and wait there and do your deals there. But Lord Elgin decided, I'm going to make a statement here and show them that you can't tell the British what to do. So I'm going to go right up to the capital and do my negotiating there, just from my ship, my big warship, I should say. As an example, they passed the Russian squadron that was tied up in Edo Bay, further out of the channel, which again, following the rules, had just stayed away from Edo, but Elgin just steamed right up, and obviously was for a moment rather perturbed that someone had had his idea before he had. But no, they were Japanese ships built like European ships, and probably belonged to the shogun. And when they landed, because the Japanese, first of all told them to go back, and he said no, said, all right then, we'll get you ashore and we'll take you to legation. And it presented a very fascinating spectacle to not only the Europeans, but to the Japanese, because many Japanese had never seen a European before. Even though the Dutch were in Nagasaki, if you didn't live in Nagasaki, the domain of Nagasaki, around that town, you would probably have never seen a Western European. So they had no real point of reference to what an Englishman was. Particularly, even the Russians, who were much more sort of present in the minds of Japanese officialdom, didn't just wander around the country. They were not allowed to land. You could be thrown in prison or executed if you washed up on Japan previous to this point.
Right.
And so they thought they were Chinese or from China. And when they went out in the streets, their only point of reference as a foreigner was essentially, well, their main point of reference, I should say, was China, because only Chinese merchants were theoretically allowed to be in Japan in a limited capacity. And so they went up to them saying, Chinaman, do you want to buy something? Basically, they would accost them in the streets.
Right. And then it was deemed offensive.
Yes, I believe it was, because yes, I remember. Yes, while they were riding around, it was made aware to those who had read Dutch histories of Japan that merchants were considered the lowest class of people in Japan. So if they called you a Chinese merchant, they were essentially assuming you were kind of dirt.
So do you also see, of course, it's that xenophobic reaction is pretty apparent in the Japanese reaction. We see that this xenophobic reaction continues even into the 20th century, because if I remember it right, even Tsar Nicholas II, when he was not the Tsar, but he was a prince and he was sent to Japan by his father, the Tsar, and upon landing, he was attacked with a sword and he was wounded in that. So he never had a good opinion about the Japanese. And also, Tsar Nicholas was pretty much bloody-minded about the Japanese. So we do see this reaction, this racism that comes from that society, and that also extends into how they deal with defeated armies in the Second World War. That militarism continues. Of course, your study does not cover all that, but did you come across these instances more frequently while going through the record?
Undoubtedly, it's unavoidable to notice that, to be honest, because what happens here is the British coming in with their own xenophobia, which is bred from the usual places in respect to foreigners, especially Japanese people, because practically every consul general said, we know nothing about these people. How am I supposed to proceed? I don't know anything about them, and everything written about them is practically wrong. And on the other hand, you have the Japanese perspective, which is that, well, essentially everyone is a barbarian outside of Japan. That includes the Chinese to some extent, who a lot of what you might call the bourgeois of Japan felt were their cultural sort of kind of superiors in a way, the Qing Empire.
Also probably explains why they treated the Chinese the way they did when they occupied.
Absolutely, yes. And
yes, yeah.
And but we should say, to be fair, that intellectual renaissance that occurred did have the result that this was not the opinion of everybody in Japan, and it was a much more textured thing in those days, because nobody really wanted the Westerners to come to Japan, but they did want to learn from them. And to learn from them, you have to entertain them, essentially, in the country, or to invite them to stay. Since they did not want to be invited and they just burst in, they were faced with this problem that they were no longer able to easily regulate how these people interacted with the Japanese. And so therefore, at the highest level of Japanese response, you have a very diplomatic, quite open-minded, civil discourse, while at the same time not surrendering the fact that we are a cultured and advanced race, which compared to you people who don't bathe and things like that, and and are just completely rude to everybody you meet, is just so superior. But at the highest levels of interaction, there was this polite diplomatic discourse. Further, and then that spreads out across the higher echelons of Japanese nobility, the daimyos, where it varied dramatically from those who were wholeheartedly in favor of embracing the Western intervention as a way of advancing their own civilization, and those who said, these people will corrupt and pollute our way of life. We need to get them out as quickly as possible, even if it means war. And then further down the level, you have the retainers of these people who either support what their daimyos say on either side, or have slightly different opinions and form a new faction, or disagree with their daimyos and leave them to wander and do their own thing. And really, all of the response the British talk about is generally referring to the warrior class, the nobility of Japan, what is called the bushi class, what we blanket term samurai class, and it is there that you find the greatest xenophobia amongst Japanese. Those who have the power to act, essentially, do act in a xenophobic way to the foreigners where they can do so, and it's just unavoidable. It's just what happens. You have two civilizations that believe they are both superior. One has been in strict isolation, and one believes that free trade is sort of a God-given gift, and through science, they believe they are superior. So it's unavoidable that this is not to be seen, and it's absolutely stark amongst the more extreme elements of both sides, to be honest.
So, if you have, I'm sure you have seen the movie, as you mentioned, The Last Samurai, and it's a very popular movie in India as well, because we have seen it so many times. It comes on every network almost. And I distinctly remember the character played by Timothy Spall. And so he's this Englishman who is, brokering deals, and he's kind of the link between the West and the East. He speaks their language, and it's very entertaining that way. How much of a truth do you see in that movie? I mean, of course, movies tend to shape our understanding of history, and many people assume whatever is shown in a movie, in a period film, as fact. So you have seen the record, you have written a book. How much accuracy do you see in that movie?
Okay. Well, my take on it is interesting because I studied the period directly before that movie is set. That is set in the Meiji period, which follows the fall of the Shogun and the Edo period. And so I'm able to read in not as much as someone who has spent their entire life studying Japanese late Edo period and Meiji period history. I would not like to say that I know more than any of these great scholars who can actually speak and read Japanese and have spent decades interpreting them. But from my perspective, from the research that I've done, it was very interesting to watch The Last Samurai and see the choices that the filmmakers made in order to create a movie, because we must acknowledge that the making of a movie requires certain things that the historical narrative just does not account for. As you were saying, the British character played by Timothy, how do you say his name? It's Timothy Spalding?
Timothy Spall, yes.
Spall, yeah, right. The British character is very interesting. He's actually very, very accurate, I think, to some of the more, what would be the word, pro-Japanese people that went to Japan. Because I spoke of the great sort of swathe of opinion in Japan, and that was the same in Britain as well. Like on the British side, there were people who deeply wanted to know more about the Japanese and wanted to basically help them any way they could, because they appreciated what they had found there so much. And then there were people who wanted to take advantage of them. And this character is probably one of the most accurate to history characters you will find, because he is a man who has obviously spent a great deal of time there because he can speak the language fluently. He can also read it and translate it. He is apparently welcomed into the court of the emperor quite easily. So he's obviously well known to the Japanese officials. So that probably means he came over, maybe part of a diplomatic mission, or perhaps he was a merchant to start with, like Thomas Glover, who was a great businessman who made a great fortune in Japan and did a lot to help the Japanese daimyos during the Boshin War. But yeah, I found him very. I think that was a very good characterization of a British subject in Japan, or a type of British subject in Japan, I should say. And I thought it was very interesting. His part was very interesting from that perspective, that he understands quite a bit about how things work, and that he's trying to make things work. He's trying to see himself as a kind of a negotiator. I thought that was very good, and I thought he played it very well. The truths of the rest of the movie are a little bit more muddied from my perspective. I mean, where do you begin, really? I mean, it is a good movie.
Right.
There's no doubt about it. It's very entertaining. It makes its point quite well, I think, and it's high. It's a good. I think it probably counts as a good historical movie, but not maybe as an alternate reality, because the Americans weren't the only people that the Japanese got to train their troops. They would hire pretty much anybody with the requisite experience at certain points. And commissions of Prussians and French were highly active in the training of and the shaping of the Japanese army. The British as well, in terms of the Navy. I know there was a commission sent over by the British to train the Japanese Navy, and which I didn't get to explore very much in the book. I think I mentioned it in passing towards the end. And so the idea that they would deliberately seek out the Americans is just a choice they made to make sure the Americans are in the movie, really, because there would be a host of European mercenaries and commissions in Japan, all training parts of the Japanese army, or so I should say, teaching their officers to train their troops and things like that. And so there's that. Then there's the curious idea of, I find it curious that they decided to portray the samurai at this stage as a kind of Indian tribe, or I say that Native American Indian tribe, or remote tribe of humble farmers, essentially, hiding away in the mountains. Equating them, therefore, as I said, like a tribe of North American Indians, who are resistant to the change that has occurred in their country. While it is absolutely fair to say that a great deal of samurai rejected the reforms of Emperor Meiji, which obliterated the old feudal system, it is not particularly accurate to portray them in a kind of a rural, all of these people in a sort of a rural hill tribe sense, as is portrayed here. Especially not a man of the stature of the main Japanese protagonist, Katsumoto, who is, I believe, he is based on a man called, the man played by Ken Watanabe, whose name is Katsumoto in the movie, is based on a man called Saigo Takamori, who was a official from Satsuma domain. He fought in the Boshin War, and he was one of the handful of people that the Japanese recognize as the people who have changed their country at this time, before at the time of the Meiji Restoration, the restoration of imperial rule over the shoguns. And he's seen in the movie as this sort of conservative defender of samurai values, the code of Bushido, which is again an anachronism slightly. And I say that there, it is essentially an anachronism to do that, because first of all, he's from Satsuma domain. And that is one of the most technologically advanced domains in Japan at that time. They formed the nucleus of the Imperial Japanese Army because of how well trained they were. And so the decision to make the samurai rebels essentially 15th, 16th century looking samurai is first of all deeply anachronistic. To have them that sort of indifferent to modern weapons as they are in the movie is anachronistic, because they were all well aware that you needed rifles and cannon and things like that to win. And even at the time of my book, you had samurai quite willingly wandering around with revolvers in their waists, along with their two swords, and manning artillery batteries, even at Kagoshima. So there's a lot of anachronism in the story, which is a deliberate narrative choice, so you know who these people are, and you know who these people are, and you know what they're about without having to think about it too much. And that's why it's a good decision. But in terms of history, it's an anachronism, and it's probably going to it probably leads to quite a lot of people getting the wrong impression of what samurai were in the 19th century.
This is, of course, a what-if question. But do you think that because the Americans opened up Japan and not the British, that's why Japan was never colonized?
Good question. I have always read into it that Japan was never colonized like the rest of the places that were colonized, just because of the time, almost because the Americans were the ones to do it, but also because of the timing of it all. So the Americans came in, and basically they wanted a place for their whaling ships to dock. And they came in and they were very bullish about it. And the Japanese response was to essentially do the Chinese model of trade ports. But the Americans, having set that example, were followed by the rest of the European powers. And indeed, however you would wish to classify the Russian side of things. And because of that, you get a kind of an impetus on trade. Now, as we both know, that is a key stage of colonial interference. The traders come and they scout the land out, and then the troops come thereafter to protect the traders, and it could have gone that way. And here's why the American thing is important. The Americans very soon got sucked into the American Civil War, and so they actually get out of the picture quite quickly. And into that space, you cram the main treaty powers, such as the British, the French, the Italians at some point, the Prussians, the Russians, and we're at a stage in colonial history where the emphasis is not necessarily on conquering anymore. And I do believe that though the fact the Americans got there first was important, it's probably not important in the way in terms of why Japan was never colonized like other places. I think it's much more important on that score to observe how Japan was run as a government at that time, and the deep problems it had trying to balance new foreign policy that they had no clear idea of how to run properly, and their own domestic problems, which were now had been accelerated by the American and then Western powers' intervention in Japanese affairs. Basically, I take it to be a mix of the fact that, certainly for the British, I can't really speak for the rest of the European powers particularly, but for the main colonizing power, which would be the British, who had done this in China already, or a model of it in China, and of course had done it in India for hundreds of years, and now I mean, this runs over the period of 1857, in fact.
Yes.
So the height of British domination of India, some might say, is approaching, but the reason I think can be boiled to, there is a trend in British foreign policy at this stage, which very much depends on the government in London. And when I say the government, I don't mean the single British government. I mean the individual governments that swap and change and move through history. Some of them are more imperialist than others. Some of them are more expansionist than others. And some of them are more conservative. At this time, there is a great disinclination to add territory to the British Empire. In fact, that's a trend actually starting almost with the Hastings trial, actually. Why on earth are we conquering more territory in the East? Is a big theme of that trial. Why is this happening? Why is it necessary? And after the Opium Wars, which was seen as a great embarrassment because it just highlighted how little control Whitehall had over these foreign, these people out on foreign embassies and positions, especially over such, nobody wanted to fight a war for merchants, basically, again. And it was becoming increasingly clear that if you, as the diplomatic representative in a particular quarter, misstepped and caused a big war over the rights of merchants and such things like that, you would probably find yourself put up before Parliament, almost certainly, and put on trial. And the risks, therefore, had to be weighed very carefully. So there's that. There's in the 1840s, the British briefly sort of occupied Hawaii. They came within an ace of deposing their monarchy and just outright taking the country. And when it was found out this has happened, it was quickly overturned and reversed. So as much as there is an certain still expansion going on, there is also a definite attempt to put the brakes on here. And so the type of colonialism is changing slightly because of just how expensive wars of conquest are, how unpopular they are at home. They can unseat governments. If you have a colonial war, such as the Opium War, it can unseat a government, and
Mhm.
just because how unpopular it is. And so in Japan, this is something that is very present, I think, in the officials going out there. And not only that, it's almost impossible for them to figure out what's going on in Japan, because nobody knows how it runs, particularly.
Mhm.
There is so much misinformation in Britain about how Japan is run that their key strategy in colonization, which is to find out who's in charge, get on their side, and eventually kind of take over the running of their government. They are unable to do that, partly because of competition from other European powers, and partly because of the disunited state of the Japanese politics at the time, as that has been sparked and accelerated by the interference of the Europeans and Americans. The shogun at this point is no longer the last word in Japanese interior politics. Many are dissatisfied with this model of government. Many, due to that intellectual renaissance I spoke of and the reawakening of interest in Japanese history, they have discovered that the shogun has only has the right to run the country with the permission of the emperor in Kyoto. And they feel that this is a great travesty that has been perpetrated. These people who feel that the emperor should be restored and as the way forward. And so as well as trying to deal with this new breed of foreign policy in Japan, the Japanese also have to deal with great interior problems of social and political nature, where the very fabric of how the country has been run for almost 300 years is being questioned and torn down, really. And when the British come into this, they don't know who's in charge. At first, they think the shogun is in charge, accurately enough, but they think he has more powers than he does. In fact, he has very little political power left. They don't know the role of the emperor, and they only cotton on to that much later down the road. And I think it is just too confusing to establish themselves. Japanese politics are too confusing at the time for the British to establish themselves in a secure way and to act as they would have done perhaps in China, where they began to sort of rule the roost through their trading operations and military operations. I could not find much that told me that the British, for these reasons of not wanting to start a war for commercial interests and the inability to comprehend Japanese political system in the first five or so years of their appearance in Japan, that would have allowed them to have taken advantage of Japan and controlled it in a colonial sense. That was a rambling way of sort of explaining it, but I think it has, rather than who got there first being the arbiter of who controls Japan from the Western world, the Japanese were so the state of Japan itself sort of negated it, especially since everybody in Japan was very aware of what had happened in China and actively did everything they could in different ways to stop it happening there. And eventually they cottoned onto the idea that we can basically use the Westerners to if we modernize to the state that they like, they won't need to colonize us in a simplistic manner, and that's what they did.
What exactly are you working on as your next project?
The next current project is a book about the Second Maratha War, which occurred between effectively between 1803 and 1806, but technically from 1802 to 1806, and is usually only studied between 1803 and 1805. and then again only usually in English anyway, through the life of the Duke of Wellington. My next book is called Bullocks, Crane, and Good Madeira. It is to be published next spring at this moment. It was going to be published at the end of this year, but certain events have meant it had to be delayed. It is at the second at the editors, with the publishers awaiting editing. You, I believe, have had it for some time now, and
yes.
I've been eager to hear your thoughts on the matter. But for at this moment, that's its state of play. This is about, and this book is hoping, I hope, if I've done my job right, it's not just about the Duke of Wellington in India, as most people see the Second Maratha War. It is about Lord Lake in Hindustan.
Right.
It is about Wellesley, as he was then, in the Deccan. It is about the aftermath, which everybody conveniently misses out. You know, everybody says the Second Maratha War removed the Marathas as the great power in India. I don't know if you agree with this, certainly it reduced them as a power that the British had to worry about deeply, but it certainly didn't remove them as the last power in India. In fact, the end of the war was really quite unfortunate for the British, certainly where in the mopping up angle, which led Lake on basically to impale himself on the walls of Barrackpur, and in his chase of Yaswantrao Holkar. And these are the themes I really wanted to get into the book, but also the theme of the Indian Army and its identity. Because as I researched the book, I found that there's a conscious reference to the Indian Army as an Indian army. There are officers who actually call it the Indian Army. In the East India Company's army, they're calling it the Indian Army, and even talk about themselves within it as a separate entity to the British Army, in a very protective way. And there are amazing instances in this war where the sepoys of the company army, the presidency armies, display a prowess over the sepoy armies of the Marathas that deeply impresses the king's officers of the British Army, and in some cases outperforms them in a very famous instance at Barrackpur.
Right. And also the fact that the Duke of Wellington at Waterloo even says that I'm going to show Napoleon what a general of sepoys can do.
Absolutely.
So, yes.
I love that bit. And I often wonder whether he, looking at his army, which he didn't quite trust at the time, whether he rather wished he had some of his sepoys with him there, such as the 7th Madras Native Infantry, who were one he counted on particularly, and things like that.
So I find it quite fascinating that he actually doesn't have a very high opinion about his troops, the English troops that he leads at Waterloo, and the kind of remarks that he makes, and this is often put in contrast with what Napoleon says about his own troops. I find that very interesting. But nevertheless, a very tall figure of history, the Duke of Wellington, as you would agree, I'm sure. And so we are looking forward to your next work, and I would recommend Wild East to all our viewers here. Please grab a copy. It's available on Amazon. It's available in India as well. And I was actually quite surprised to find, there you go. That's the cover. That's the book. The British in Japan. I was actually quite pleasantly surprised to find my name in your acknowledgement. So thank you very much for that.
Well, I definitely had many conversations with many people who helped in the writing of it. And you were definitely one of those people.
Right. So to wind up, I'd like to ask you one final question. What was the most memorable experience while writing Wild East for you?
The most memorable experience of writing Wild East came in the research stage. I had the luxury of having been able to research it for quite a while in the run-up. As I said, there was quite a long run-up to writing it. I specifically concentrated on English language sources because there was no time to delve deeply into Japanese linguistics and history and things like that. Even in the long length of time there was, I couldn't do it all. But the most memorable thing, I think, was going to the National Archives and discovering a wealth of Foreign Office records that were written by the people that I had been reading about in secondary sources, such as, N.S. Satow's is there too, Sir Rutherford Alcock and St. John Neal. And just being able to read the thoughts of these people in the form of their reports back to the Foreign Office was an amazing experience. And knowing that this piece of paper this was a connection, essentially. This piece of paper was a tactile connection to a moment in 1862 or 3, where on one evening, thousands of miles ago and hundreds of years ago, someone put a pen on this, put a pen with ink onto this paper to write about something that they had seen, which was not only they had seen, but was an ongoing subject that would be corresponded about. Was just a fascinating mental sort of occurrence. And I sat for far too long at the National Archives, just staring at these pieces of paper rather than actually researching them, because I was just so sort of caught up in the thought of what they represented.
Right.
One of the best things I found was an amazing enclosure inside one of the Foreign Office volumes, which was to do with the fact that the Japanese, who tried to keep the foreigners and the Japanese people apart, wanted to build a second road to Edo that only the foreigners would essentially use. And they had their cartographers draw it. And there's a beautiful piece of folded crepe paper in one of these volumes, which was annotated with English translations that were done by the British translators in the legation, and it's very delicate watercolors and tiny little Japanese calligraphy, hair thin Japanese calligraphy along this winding road, and this was an amazing little thing to find. Yes, the National Archives research stands out, I think, as the most remarkable thing that I encountered when writing Wild East. Not perhaps putting aside the fact that this is my first book, and to actually hold it in my hand is a very surreal experience.
It is, of course. I understand the feeling. It's a special feeling. You can't really. I remember that MasterCard advertisement that says that there are some things that money can't buy.
Yeah.
And for everything else, there's MasterCard. So this is like one of those things that money can't buy. That experience. Yeah. But thank you very much for your time and for sharing your thoughts with us, Josh. It was lovely hearing you. Hope to talk to you soon about your next book.
Absolutely, we'll have to do that, definitely.